The New York City subway system is the most extensive and important metro system in all of North America, and it shows. It's the backbone of the city, with the majority of commuters, nearly 59%, arriving in Manhattan via the subway alone, with an additional 9% arriving via the MTA's commuter rail and bus system, and the Roosevelt Tramway too. And while it has its many upsides that help move over 5 million people per day, it also has its downsides. Lots of downsides. For example, the system has barely expanded over the past 50 years. Matter of fact, it's actually lost things like the 3rd Avenue Elevated. The system is also dirty, and many lines' frequencies are not the best, especially the Sir. I would know. And whenever the MTA does plan on expanding, it always takes a long time to even leave the planning stages, is unnecessarily expensive, and sometimes gets cut back or just doesn't make it past its proposal. And it's infuriating to watch each and every time. Delays are also commonplace, and homelessness is also an issue, though to be fair, the MTA has no control over that. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, systems like Paris's RATP are going under massive expansions with magnitudes cheaper per track mile cost. Hell, even this expansion is being ridiculed in France for being too expensive. Meanwhile, we're spending half the amount it takes for 68 new stations and 125 new miles of track in France on 8.5 miles of track and 16 new stations. And it's embarrassing to watch too. So all this has gotten many people, me included, thinking, why is the MTA like this, and how do we fix it? Well, first, let's go way back to where it started, and I get to use my oldies music collection again. Trust me, it's important. In 1894, the Rapid Transit Act was signed into law. This created a board of people who would plan out new train lines and either build it directly or lease it to a private company for 50 years. It should also be noted that this wasn't the first time a board of transit commissioners was created from a bill. Eventually, a contract was signed between the commission and a construction company funded by the head of the IRT in 1900. The planned line would stretch from City Hall all the way to 145th Street, which is longer than the entire 2nd Avenue subway plan. And this map. In just 4 years and $1.2 billion in today's money later, the first ever subway line was completed in 1904. This may make it seem like a big reason transit in New York fell off is because of inadequate funding, a reason being that the IRT and BMT used money mostly from the city government to build new lines, of which they were provided a lot of. That $1.2 billion was provided by the commission to the Rapid Transit Construction Company to provide to the total cost of building the line, while the RTCC paid for things like signals and rolling stock. However, while the amount of funding given by the city or state government does play a role here, it isn't exactly the whole story, as the MTA has an operating budget of over $19 billion today. This is even significantly more than TfL's operating budget, around $11.3 billion, and TfL is doing objectively better than the MTA. And this brings us to our first reason: poorly used funding and additional expenses. The MTA is currently in $48 billion of debt, and they expect 18% of the revenue to go to paying it this year. So automatically that's $3.5 billion gone just for debt the MTA was almost forced to rack up because of the highly efficient cost of nearly everything they do. An example being Grand Central Madison, which I'll make clear, I like Grand Central Madison, but to think that it, which is mostly escalators and wall art, let's be honest here, costed $11 billion is insane to me. It also ended up being $7 billion over budget, and the MTA apparently had to use debt to pay for most of the over budget cost. The MTA also uses their funding horribly, with everything they do being expensive. Hell, this staircase costed $30 million. I don't even know how that begins to happen. It's not even that deep, it goes like 20 feet underground. While we do need a full audit of the MTA to really see where all the money's going, they have been many times before, but to a lesser extent. In one, it was revealed that the MTA kept on giving new contracts to contractors who reportedly had poor reviews. In other words, the MTA was paying bad contractors and keeping them there. In another, simple miscommunications caused the MTA to spend $3 million more than planned on signal upgrades. And in a separate audit, it was found that a fleet of nearly 2,000 MTA non-revenue service vehicles weren't being managed well, and this was paired with there being no inventory system to track parts bought to maintain the aforementioned vehicles, causing them to become untraceable to a vehicle or downright missing. Maintenance costs then went on to be over $50 million. My point isn't how bad the MTA is, we already know this, but all of these problems and a complete fiscal nightmare, a lot of people, me included, wondered if the only way to fix the MTA is a complete restructuring from the ground up. However, there is some hope. First of all, remember when Andy Byford became the president of the MTA? And remember when on-time performance went from 58% to 83% among other major improvements? Byford, who is still the topic for a separate video, proved that the MTA is fixable. And while the infuriating reasons he isn't with New York anymore do cause a bit of doubt in my mind that somebody actually competent would even be allowed to exist in the MTA, it still gives hope that a better MTA is actually possible without restructuring the entire thing. However, competence within the MTA is rare, so if we were to fix the MTA by other means, what would that look like? Well, first, a general audit in the MTA is necessary. Tens of billions of dollars just don't get funded to your average transit agency with barely anything to show for it. Next, it depends on where the problems are. We have no way of truly knowing currently. However, the closest we can get is a study from NYU Professor Goldwyn, which revealed that 1. The MTA and other city agencies tend to fight. Despite being public agencies on public land, they'll still fight over it for some reason, and a sort of settlement often involves a lot of money. For example, when 2nd Avenue Subway Phase 1 was being built, the MTA needed to use a playground for construction. The Parks Department then charged the MTA $15 million for it. They're all fragmented and fighting each other. If public agencies work together, like they should, things wouldn't be as complicated. Sure, the MTA is a state agency and others are city agencies. However, I say that doesn't really excuse it. 2. Politics can complicate things. Optimistically, politicians would actually help the MTA, but that's obviously not the case here. The study highlights that politicians end up micromanaging the MTA and projects, and sometimes it's management. Actually, many times it's management. This causes the MTA to have to put the politicians' often inefficient and expensive demands and plans, which end up inflating the cost. If politicians would secure the MTA's funding, but also not micromanage the MTA at every turn, the MTA would be able to work in peace without political intervention. For example, remember when the government provided $1.2 billion to the RTCC and then left them alone, to which they then built the first subway line which stretched 9 miles, which is even more than the 2nd Avenue subway? Of course this was in 1904, but I doubt the cost of boring and labor went up 14-fold. 3. The MTA tends to outsource too much. Of course, labor does cost a lot when it comes to the MTA, especially when construction takes multiple times longer than it should. But outsourcing expertise is expensive too. For example, the MTA had a branch of 1,600 in-house capital managers that designed 90% of their projects. But by the time they were building new things like the 7 train extension, the new Fulton Street, 2nd Avenue Subway Phase 1, and East Side Access, the branch shrunk to 124 employees who were probably not having a very good time. The MTA constantly works on varying projects, so it makes sense to have an in-house team to handle all of it, instead of outsourcing at every turn. Every new station they build is also unnecessarily massive, which definitely doesn't help, and all of that was only covering new projects, and not even diving into what causes delays and latency. But now that we know all this, and that it isn't really corruption in the MTA that's causing this as far as I know, I was horribly wrong in this comment. The question that still stands here is, why? Here's where I'll make the point that this transit nightmare that the city is going through, or at least the fiscal part of it, isn't actually the MTA's fault. Look back at all the reasons that the MTA is broke. In terms of debt, the MTA ended up having to borrow money because of the high costs, which reasons were just discussed because the state government refused to pay the extra costs. City agencies fighting and the politics are self-explanatory, and as for labor, well, I'd imagine the long construction of projects inflate the labor costs by a lot, and the pandemic followed by a job-cutting effort certainly doesn't help here. And as for outsourcing, unfortunately I couldn't find anything else on what happened to the in-house financial management team, though it's hard to believe that the MTA would just make its financial team under a tenth of its original size. In the end, it doesn't matter so much why. The MTA is still an inefficient, expensive mess, and our transit isn't going to get much better if we don't figure out how to fix it. Whether it be a complete overhaul of how the MTA is ran, or addressing our issues with our politics, we still need a better MTA, rid of delays, expensive and slow projects, and debt, and a better MTA equipped with things like CBTC and all NCTs. And maybe then our staircases won't cost $30 million. $30 million is crazy. Hey, it's the outro part. And yes, the tell me if I did something wrong part applies here again, because this is the first time I went into the history of something, and also a video on how to fix something extremely hard to fix that a lot of people gave different takes on. And as you can tell from a few parts of this video, I've learned how to use After Effects, and by learned I mean like watching like 2 tutorials and learning how to do literally 2 things. And I'm starting to learn more of Photoshop. But anyways, as I said last time, how much of I upload after then depends on how much of a pain this year will be. Spoilers, it's looking painful. But I still have time to make these. And even if I didn't, I'd probably still make these because it's actually really fun. Even though sometimes the editing app bugs out, causing me to rage a bit. It's still a mobile editor after all. But I guess that's it. So see you when I see you. I'm pretty sure what next video will be, but I'm still not telling. it would just make its financial team under a tenth of its original size. In the MTA, I meant to say in the end.